TÜSİAD Silikon Vadisi Ağı'nın değerli üyeleri, değerli konuklar.
Dear esteemed members of TÜSİAD Silicon Valley Network and our esteemed guests.
Türkiye'deki acı depremi ve bu tür felaketlere karşı odaklı çözüm arayışlarını ele alacağımız konferansımıza hoş geldiniz.
Welcome to our conference where we will discuss the painful earthquake that struck Turkey and the search for technology-oriented solutions against such disasters.
Keşke daha iyi şartlar altında bir araya geliyor olsaydık.
I wish we were getting together under better circumstances.
Ülke olarak çok büyük bir acı yaşadık.
As a country, we've suffered a great deal of pain.
Hayatını kaybeden vatandaşlarımızı anıyoruz. Yaraların hızla sarılmasını temenni ediyoruz.
We commemorate our citizens who lost their lives with mercy, and we hope that the wounds will heal quickly.
Depremden hemen sonra canla başla çalışan tüm kurtarma ekiplerine, yardıma koşan bütün vatandaşlarımıza ve desteklerini esirgemeyen bütün ülkelere minnettarlığımızı sunuyoruz.
We also would like to express our gratitude to all the rescue teams who worked very hard after the earthquake, all our citizens who rushed to help, and to all the countries that provided their support.
Türk iş dünyası depremin ardından hemen seferber oldu.
The Turkish business world mobilized immediately after the earthquake.
Felaketin ilk günlerinde TÜSİAD deprem destek ağını oluşturduk.
In the first days of the disaster, we created the TÜSİAD Earthquake Support Network.
Gerek destek ağımız üzerinden, gerekse üye şirketlerin ağlarıyla bölgenin önceliklerini karşılamak için var gücümüzle çalıştık.
We worked hard to meet the priority needs of the region, both through our support network and with the networks of member companies.
İlk aşamada barınma, giyim, gıda, ilaç, hijyen malzemesi, jeneratör, yakıt, makine ekipman gibi acil ihtiyaçları ulaştırmaya odaklandık.
At the first stage of this effort, we focused on delivering the urgent needs, such as shelter, clothing, medicine, hygiene materials, generators, fuel, and machinery equipment.
Üyelerimiz ayni ve nakdi yardımlarını sürdürüyor.
Our members continue to provide in-kind and cash assistance.
Bölgedeki iş dünyası paydaşlarımız, Türkonfet ve yurt dışındaki iş dünyası paydaşlarımız ile uzun vadeli işbirliği içerisindeyiz.
We are in long-term cooperation with our business partners in the region, such as Turkonfed and partners abroad.
Önümüzdeki süreçte önceliğimiz bölgenin sosyal ve ekonomik açıdan toparlanmasına ve istihdamın korunmasına katkı sağlamaktır.
Our priority in the coming period is to contribute to the social and economic recovery of the region and to the preservation of employment.
İş dünyası olarak toplumsal dayanışmayla bölgenin yaşadığı zorluğun üstesinden hep birlikte geleceğiz.
As the business world, together we will overcome the difficult region with social solidarity.
Bir taraftan bölgede depremin yaralarını sarılmasına odaklanırken, diğer taraftan ileride yaşanacak olan İstanbul depremine de hazırlamamız gerekiyor.
While we focus on healing the wounds of the earthquake in the region, we also need to prepare for a potential future earthquake in Istanbul.
TÜSİAD Deprem Görev Gücü Koordinasyonu'nda iş dünyasının depreme hazırlığı konusunda 2 rapor yayınlamıştık.
Published 2 reports on the earthquake preparedness of the business world under the coordination of the TÜSİAD Earthquake Task Force.
Enerji, bilgi iletişim, ulaştırma, tarım ve finans gibi kritik sektörlerin afet yönetimindeki ihtiyaçlarını ortaya koymuştuk.
In these reports, we have revealed the disaster management needs of critical sectors such as energy, information and communication, transportation, and finance.
Şimdi de işletmelerin deprem öncesi, sırası, sonrası aksiyonlar için yol gösterici bir kılavuz üzerine çalışıyoruz.
Now, we're working on putting together a guide for the actions that the businesses can take before, during, and after the earthquake.
Bugünkü konferansın da bütün bu hazırlıklara katkı sağlayacağını umuyorum.
I hope that today's conference will contribute to all these efforts in preparedness.
Neticede bilim insanlarını dikkate almamanın bedelini maalesef çok ağır oldu.
After all, the price of ignoring the warnings of scientists was unfortunately very heavy.
Yaşanan acıların tekrarlanmaması için afetlere hazırlığın ve afet sonrası sürecin çok iyi planlanması ve koordine edilmesi gerekiyor.
In order to not repeat the suffering already experienced, disaster preparedness and post process need to be well planned and coordinated.
Bilimin ışığında gerekli hazırlıkları hızla tamamlarsak, afetler başımıza geldiğinde olumsuz etkilenme seviyemiz de azalacaktır.
If we complete the necessary preparations quickly in the light of science, the level of negative impact we will experience will decrease when disasters strike us.
Biz de bu konferansta hem akademisyenleri hem teknoloji alanında çalışan uzmanları ve girişimcilik, yeni fikirlerin, yeni araştırmaların duyulmasına aracı olmak istiyoruz.
At this conference, we would like to listen to both academics and experts in working in the field of technology and entrepreneurs, and to be a tool for new ideas and new research to be heard.
Bu vesileyle bütün konuşmacılarımıza katkılarından dolayı teşekkür etmek istiyorum.
I would like to take this opportunity to thank all our speakers for their contributions.
Değerli konuklar, bir deprem ülkesi olduğumuzu unutmak ve unutturmamak için biz sivil toplum örgütlerine çok iş düşüyor.
Distinguished guests, we non-governmental organizations have a lot of work to always remember that we are an earthquake country.
Bunu her açıdan yaşamsal bir mesele olarak görüyoruz.
We see this as a vital issue in every aspect.
Bu çalışmalarımıza katkılarınızı bekliyoruz.
We welcome your contributions to this work.
İlginiz için tekrar teşekkür ediyorum. Verimli bir konferans olmasını diliyorum.
Thank you again for your interest and support, and I wish you all a productive conference.
Hepinizi saygıyla selamlıyorum.
And I respectfully greet you all.
Thank you, Orhan Bey. We appreciate your remarks. Next, I would like to introduce the chair, Ayşegül İldeniz, whom needs no introduction in this room. Ayşegül's leadership here has been instrumental in standing up a most effective business network of Turkish American entrepreneurs, professionals, innovators, and investors here in the Bay Area. And I welcome her to deliver her opening remarks.
Thank you, Barış, for that great introduction. Hoş geldiniz öncelikle sevgili dostlar. I want to welcome everybody who's joining us today. It's a pleasure to finally get together. This is an annual conference that we made it a habit to start holding, except for the COVID. So it's been 3 years that we haven't gotten together. So it's an honor to have our president, başkanımız, and the board members of TÜSİAD here in person. You folks know very well it's rather extraordinary times in Turkey with the earthquake and the floods, as well as the upcoming election. Therefore, we feel incredibly privileged that they did take the time for a couple of days to come out here. And the whole purpose is indeed to listen to distinguished scientists, knowledge workers, and understand us as the Bay Area entrepreneurs and professionals and business people as we work together as well as give back to Turkey. So thank you for coming out here for sure. We as the Turks in Bay Area, certainly when the earthquake have happened, felt it very strongly in our hearts and in our minds, because it's our motherland, and there's at least a couple of you unfortunately whose families have been indeed impacted in this audience by the earthquake. So since then, I know that of you have rallied how to help, give back. Hence, we have raised millions of dollars here in the Bay Area through organizations based in the United States to give back to the earthquake victims and the survivors out in Turkey. And we certainly will continue to do so, again, as I mentioned, through the various organizations, philanthropic organizations that are active. Maybe a couple of words, if I may, about the TÜSİAD Silicon Valley Network. It's a network that we have built back in 2017. We are over 400 people strong. And as Barış has mentioned, we're made up of entrepreneurs, professionals. There are lawyers, there's business people, there's all sorts of different folks from different walks of life. And our purpose here is to gather for two. Number one is we're trying to build up a healthy network to support each other. It is very important that the Turks and the business people of the Turkish descent know each other, and we mentor each other, and we build these business ties to do better work together. The second purpose, of course, and we are indeed a part of TÜSİAD organization, is to establish and build better and stronger business ties Turkish community. We do want to keep giving back and find ways to continue doing better business with Turkey. As I'm sure all of you like me, I feel incredibly connected back to my home country. We are striving to find ways to give back to Turkey. So therefore, I will take this opportunity to invite all of you to join the effort. Us. We will have a session of networking after the speeches of our extinguished guests out here, that we can get to know you better, and we can keep exploring ways how we better ourselves as well as our country for the better days ahead of us. I do want to take another moment to do a small recognition. Ayça Alemdaroğlu, where's Ayça? Oh, there she is. Okay. Ayça, thank you very much for your sponsorship for the program. Freeman Spogli Institute program on Turkey is behind this organization, and we're very privileged to be at Stanford due to your efforts, and thank you for that. So as I mentioned, I do look very much forward to the panel that's going to be held about the future of how to evade these, or it's not avoidable, but rather hurting ourselves is certainly available through technology and through other progressive means. We look forward to listen to it. And as I mentioned, after that, we look forward to interacting and getting to know you better. And thank you again for being out here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ayşegül Hanım. I'm going to turn to our speakers now. You all have their bios in your handout, so I will only introduce them briefly, save more time for discussion at the end. Our first speaker is Professor William Ellsworth. He's a research professor at the Department of Geophysics at Stanford University. He focuses on seismological study of active faults, the earthquakes they generate, and the physics of the earthquake source. He will speak about the science behind the earthquakes in Turkey with a focus on the hazard as it was known beforehand. Professor Ellsworth, thank you for your time and welcome to the
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here today and to have the opportunity to kick off this session with my distinguished colleagues. My plan is to lay the groundwork here so that we'll talk about the why, the how, and the what of the earthquake. And this will be a good transition, I hope, to what my engineering colleagues will have to tell you about the human side of the earthquake. So let's go ahead and get started. So, out of Turkey. It may be familiar to many of you, but for us, it's a hazard map. It describes where earthquakes will occur someday in the future. No one can say when, but we know that they will happen someday. This is a map that was made a few years ago, and I think very accurately depicts the earthquake hazard in your country. So to get started, Turkey is in kind of a rough neighborhood. It's getting squeezed from the south and from the north, and I'm not speaking geopolitically. Tectonically, the Arabian Plate is pushing north at a rate of about 1 centimeter per year, so not quite as fast as your fingernails grow. And as it moves north, Turkey is escaping to the west. It's moving primarily along the East Anatolian Fault. See if the laser will work here. It's all right. It's moving primarily along the East Anatolian Fault and the North Anatolian Fault. The North Anatolian Fault is the most famous one simply because it's had more recognizable earthquakes, particularly a very important sequence during most of the 20th century, culminating with the 1999 earthquake in Izmit. Well, the East Anatolian Fault is one that sits there and it slowly accumulates the motion of the tectonic plates until at some point it reaches its breaking point and it snaps to produce an earthquake. This doesn't happen very often. If it's moving at an of about 1 centimeter per year and it moves 4 meters in an earthquake, it takes 4 centuries to build up that time. So on a human time scale, most of the time the fault is just sitting there waiting. And it's for this reason that we need to use all of the tools in our toolkit to be able to evaluate faults like this to understand what the hazard is that they pose. Well, when the earthquake happened, suddenly the North Anatolian Fault jumped forward. The East Anatolian Fault jumped forward. Laser on this, maybe. Do I have a pointer? Okay, no. So let's just look. The colors here on the map are taken from a satellite, and they tell us what direction the ground moved at the time of the earthquake. The warmer colors indicate movement to the east, the cooler colors movement to the west. So during the earthquake, the fault moved an average of about 4 to 6 meters. That motion released the energy that had been building for centuries. And so the earthquake is a relaxation, but unfortunately that relaxation sends coursing through the earth. So let's take a little closer look at this fault. So when the earthquake moved, it shook the ground violently. This is a map from the US Geological Survey that shows in color the shaking levels. The orange colors, which outline the fault, through here, are where the most severe shaking occurred. And I think you can also see that there's a gray color on the background here. That represents population density. Unfortunately, the East Anatolian Fault, working over geologic time, made wonderful places for people to live. So a long series of valleys are filled with small cities and people living in those areas. So they were very heavily impacted along the length of the rupture. More than 400 kilometers of the fault moved in the instant of that earthquake. It was followed 9 hours later by another earthquake to the north, almost as large. The main shock being magnitude 7.8. The great 1906 earthquake that we had on the San Andreas Fault, just a few kilometers to the west. And then the second earthquake about magnitude 7.5, both of them very powerful shocks. So if we take a closer look now at how this earthquake unfolded, we'd like to understand how we go from a fault that's sitting passively to one that snaps and produces such violent motions. So the earthquake actually initiated not on the main fault, but on another fault, one that we didn't know very much about beforehand. And during its rupture, the earthquake propagated to the north along this fault, producing an earthquake of about magnitude 7. Some of you may have been in the Bay Area in 1989 when the Loma Prieta earthquake hit. That's our largest earthquake in many years. It was magnitude 7. So that earthquake was strong enough that people would feel it and they would say, my gosh, we're having a terrible earthquake. They were. But unfortunately, the earthquake moved to the north. It intersected the East Anatolian Fault and spawned a rupture that ran both to the east and to the west and south. So this very complicated process unleashed the energy that had been stored for centuries. We're going to take a look now at just one place on the fault to give us a better understanding about how the earthquake unfolded. We're going to look at a small city named Tukulu. Did I know correctly or not? But it's in a beautiful location. It's situated against the face of a mountain to the north, so it would receive beautiful sunshine during most of the year. It has a fertile plain below it. It's undoubtedly an area that has been populated since millennia. It has the unfortunate location of being essentially right on the East Anatolian Fault. So here is a map in the upper corner that shows the basic geography. To the north, we have the mountains. There's a river that you can see right in the middle from the north coming down, leading to this very beautiful plain. And the city itself is situated here, just on the fan, on the edge of the mountains. We could tell from satellite data that was analyzed using machine learning and other techniques within just a day or two that about 5% of the buildings in this city were damaged. And so we know immediately what the human cost is. Our job is really to understand what are the forces that those buildings were subjected to, and what can we learn from the shaking in this earthquake that will help us better prepare for earthquakes in the future. Fortunately, there was a seismic station located here, just about 3 kilometers from the trace of the fault. And it provided very key information about the level of shaking that occurred at this site. It really helps us understand why so many damaged. So let's take a look now at the record of this earthquake. So this figure shows some graphs that are recordings at this particular site. And the top panel here shows the acceleration of the ground as measured in the east-west direction during the course of the earthquake. The time scale here is about 1.5 minutes. And you'll notice 2 things. There's an initial kind of wide stretch there that I've labeled the first shock, magnitude 7. So that's the earthquake on the subsidiary fault. It runs and hits the main fault, spawning the rupture running back. And then finally, when the very large waves arrive around second number 60, is when the rupture actually goes past this site. And that's very clearly seen in the next panel and the bottom panel, which show not the acceleration of the ground, but the velocity the ground was moving and the actual displacement of the earth. The displacement in this case was about 1 meter at this site. 1 meter to the west at this site. On this side of the fault, if we had a station on the opposite side, it would have moved 1 meter to the east, giving 2 meters of total displacement. So these are the forces. And what really terrifies me as I look at this record is that the main motion only lasted about 5 seconds. This tremendous velocity pulse, as we would call it, through. And that was what the buildings were subjected to. Perhaps some had been weakened by the initial shaking. It would have been about like we would have experienced in the Loma Prieta earthquake here at Stanford. Strong, but not damaging to well-built structures. But when these large waves arrived, it really tests structures as to how competent they are. So looking ahead, looking back, the Turkish government installed a whole set of not just one instrument, but many instruments along this fault. This is the best recorded earthquake ever. And it will be one that scientists and engineers will be studying for decades. So if anything good comes out of this earthquake, it's these precious data that have been captured. The graph that I'm showing here shows the progression of the earthquake as it ruptured from Turkoglu all the way down south to Antioch at the south. And so one can just and see that this velocity pulse moves continuously down the fault at a speed of about 3 kilometers per second. So very, very rapid rupture running down. Of course, at many of these sites, they felt waves arriving before the earthquake arrived, and that's why there's often discussion of feeling more than one earthquake. But as I say, these are going to be very precious information that earthquake engineers and seismologists will be studying for decades. Many things are going on now. From an excellent report by Mustafa Erdek, a colleague of mine in Turkey, and many other colleagues that describe some of the early interpretation of the earthquake. The URL is given here. It's from Temblor, and I would recommend it to you as a very good summary of what happened to the earthquake. Right now, we're in the aftershock period. We'll be feeling aftershocks will be occurring for months, if not years. This is something we just know will happen, and it certainly is following standard here at this point. So I'd like to close by very briefly taking a look at the hazard map of Turkey and looking about how I, as an earthquake scientist, think about it as a handoff to what my engineering colleagues will discuss. So the map shows what is likely to happen over a period of about 500 years in Turkey. We're really more interested in what happens during our human lifetimes. And on large parts of the North Anatolian Fault, it is ruptured within the last century. So it is relatively at this time. The one part of the fault that is not broken is unfortunately in the Sea of Marmara. So you all know what that means. For the East Anatolian Fault, it is also largely ruptured at this time. And a big question will be, do these motions continue onto the Dead Sea Fault? So that's a big question for us as we look about the larger tectonic picture. Well, to build one of these maps, we bring together all of our tools as our scientists and engineers. We develop a forecast that tells us how frequently earthquakes occur on the faults. We estimate the seismic shaking that will come from those, and then we add them up. And that's how we come up with a hazard map. This is very standard practice. You have very good maps in Turkey. So how can we use these maps? And how does hazard differ from risk? Often we use those two terms interchangeably, but in a technical sense, we need to really keep hazard and risk separate in our minds. Is a source of potential danger or harm. So a busy street is a hazard to a pedestrian, but it only presents a risk if we decide to cross it. So risk is that chance of some suffering harm. And the way we put the two together is we talk about risk as being the combination of the hazard, the exposure to the hazard, the fragility, and the resilience. So we can't do anything about the hazard. That's where the fault is. The earthquakes are going to happen. Make choices about the exposure, about where we locate things and how we construct them. We can control the fragility of buildings. We can decide how structures should be built. How did they survive earthquakes? I think that in Turkey, there were many structures that were built to code that survived. They may need to be completely demolished, but they did their job. People got out of them alive. And finally, we can reduce the risk if we address the issue of resiliency, how well we respond to earthquakes. So with that, I'll finish my remarks and we'll turn them over to Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ellsworth. That was wonderful. Next, we have Ayşe Hortaçsu. She is the Director of Projects at the Applied Technology Council here in Redwood. Right? Redwood, and she's led numerous projects on post-earthquake safety evaluation, seismic performance assessment of buildings, seismic retrofit of buildings, and assessments. And she just returned from Turkey, from the field, and she'll be able to provide us with an up-to-date assessment of that. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today. It's also a delight. This is the first time anybody can pronounce my name at the introduction. So I really appreciate that. Okay. As was mentioned, I returned from Turkey about 2 weeks ago now. I'll be reporting on what we saw on our trip. And I am with the Applied Technology Council, but I was deployed by the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute. This is a 75-year institution headquartered in the Bay Area. But one of the programs they have is for the last 50 years, they have been focusing on learning from earthquakes. Why do we have to learn from earthquakes? Because we can't test everything. You know, we have shake tables at universities and we build models. Maybe we build one column, but it's not the same. We have to see what happened at a real earthquake with these shakings in real life. So the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute was able to deploy us to the field. There was two of us, me and Ayhan İrfanoğlu from Purdue University. And we spent about 7 days on the field and visited 20 cities. And this was actually not my first earthquake where I went to go learn. In 1989, I was actually on campus here. I was a student. I was an undeclared engineering student. I didn't know what to do with my life. And then the earthquake in Turkey happened. And I said, okay, that's my home. California might be my future home. So I better do something about earthquakes. And here I am 25 years later. And I studied with Anchor Mijian and Greg Gerline. So thank you for getting me here. As Professor Ellsworth showed, this is the seismic hazard map of Turkey, and that is the region where the earthquake was effective. And as he also mentioned, that there is a very dense ground motion accelerometer network. The one thing that's happening right now is that the data is getting cleaned up. You know, because we left so early. When we left, there were these huge records that we were really concerned about, and then they disappear. There's a little bit of cleanup going on right now. So I think the researchers over time are going to be finalizing these records. They have to check every station and make sure that the machine. And on our visits, we were supported by a team back home here, actually Professor Eduardo Miranda at Stanford, and he and his team would provide us with information very similar to what Professor Ellsworth showed. Here's a station in this town, and here's a satellite image that was prepared. This is from the European Union's Copernicus satellites. These are, again, estimates prepared by machine learning to show losses and damage may happen. So we were literally driving around, telling our driver, turn left, turn right. I'm trying to get to this cluster of damaged buildings. And what do we see on site? The typical construction in Turkey, a lot of you will be familiar with this, are reinforced concrete moment frames with hollow clay tile. So this is how we have been building for a very long time. It's very different than how we build here in California. There are some similarities, but this the infill clay tile that adds a lot of weight, but also a lot of insulation. We don't use that in California. At the same time, it can also fall on people's heads. So I think a lot of casualties can also come just from the type of construction. Okay, I'm going to kind of take you guys on a tour with me. We started in Elbistan, up north near Kayseri. We drove to Gölbaşı and then to Kahramanmaraş. This photo was on the right is basically the first thing I saw. We woke up at 7 a.m. It was a 7-hour drive from Ankara. And this is the first photo on my camera roll. And the damage just did not stop. This is a soft story collapse in the older part of town. However, in the outer regions of the city, there were other buildings that were taller, under construction, so we could actually see every crack, and they were in Elbistan. The interesting thing about Elbistan is that is the epicenter of the second earthquake. So unfortunately, we haven't been able to find data, but after the 4 a.m. earthquake, what we heard is that only about 20 buildings collapsed, which means everybody ran out. They were on the street when the 1 p.m. earthquake struck. And at that time, about 80% of the town was demolished. So data for this, I've been asking, are there satellites that pass by just between 4 a.m. and 1 p.m.? But that would be something very interesting to study. The next city is Gölbaşı. Of course, you know what this means. This is on the side of a lake, which means the foundation, the earth there is not very strong. So you have to build really mindful to your earth, your zemin. And they did not do this in this case. So this is the structural engineer did a decent job, but the geotechnical engineer, or the lack of it, did not. So the building leaned sideways, and it's being held up by the neighbor. This is Kahramanmaraş. It was my first time visiting this beautiful city. It is so beautiful, and of course, as all of you know, it's the city of ice cream. The children love the sticky ice cream, and there's this beautiful mural on that is now collapsed. The good news here is that this is actually the only collapsed school building we saw. The earthquake happened at 4 a.m., so the kids would not have perished in school buildings. Perhaps actually, if they were in school, their lives would have been saved. So there's been a lot of investment in Turkey towards strengthening schools, and we definitely saw that in action. And that truck right there is not a school bus. There were donated, labor and machinery and tools from every municipality you can think of. So I thought that was a very touching and very sad thing to see. But there was hearses from everywhere around the country in Maraş. This is the center of Maraş, was devastated. I think they have about 14,000 collapsed, heavily damaged, or to be demolished buildings. And one of the main reasons for this, and you'll see Antakya, is that, as the professor mentioned, they're all along the fault line. Why are people settling there? Because rivers came through, they brought the good soil, the alluvial soil, so it's good for farming. So people settled along these lines, and they settled there a long time ago, built these buildings 40, 50, 60 years ago, before we had the good building codes. We didn't even have them in the US back then. So now these centers of towns are the ones that were devastated. On the outskirts of town, this is up on the hills, so the older town is over here. They have taller buildings with very, very minimal damage. So again, these are taller, newer buildings on better soil, so they did not have damage as bad as the other ones. I'm going to tell you a story of 4 hospitals in Kahramanmaraş. This first hospital is it's a Şehir hospital. It's a city hospital run by another one, a private hospital in the middle of the town. And then 2 next to each other, one under construction and one about 10 to 12 years old, right outside of the city. The city hospital was functioning. They have about 300, 400 person capacity. And even immediately after the earthquake, they did not skip an hour. At 4 a.m., they had the earthquake, their power and electricity, they had their backup systems came back on, so they serve all these patients. Again, remember, this city has 14,000 heavily damaged buildings. What does that mean? There's patients. They need the hospital. After the 1 p.m. earthquake, even the doctors said, I'm out of here. They left, they ran home. Luckily, on day 2, a professor came by and said, you know what, I looked at your building, low damage, you can go back in. So when we were there, they were already operating. The private hospital did not do so well. There's some major damage. And again, that is a room you do not want to be in. On the outskirts of town was a new hospital under construction. So you may have heard about these in the news. There are, I believe, 12 base isolated hospitals, either under construction or completed in Turkey. These are kind of the great success stories out of this earthquake. It's an investment. I don't want to say big, you have to value your judgment there. But this one was under construction and not even one of those scaffoldings moved. But however, next to it is this hospital that is 10 to 12 years old. And we were there on day 10 or day 12 after the earthquake, and it was still not working. This is a 400 patient capacity hospital that was not able to serve their patients, only because their ceilings fell. There was a fire in the mechanical room. It was just dirty. There was nothing struck the building. A corner of it was, but you can always cordon that off and not use that wing. But these are what we consider simple and cheap solutions for making sure that your important buildings continue functioning. This next one is even more heartbreaking. This is the same hospital. This is their reserve water tank. They had 600 cubic meters of water capacity, but it wasn't designed to be in a seismic area. This valve right there pulled out of the tank, and then the top of it sloshed around, hit the column, and poured all of its water. And again, a hospital cannot function without water, because they also didn't have water from the city. So what are they supposed to do? So again, day 12, they were serving out of a field hospital. And this was the story we saw by almost every hospital we drove by. We did not see apparent structural damage. And the hospitals are fine, they didn't collapse, but they can't function. Again, what's the point of a hospital that doesn't work? Oh my God, I'm gonna speed up. Now we're going to Antakya. Of course, this area was devastated. These are, again, satellite images that show collapse estimates. And the shaking in this area was just unprecedented. I think a lot of what's going to happen in the earthquake engineering profession is that we're going to be changing the data use for ground motions. And this, my colleague showed me this picture. This is a picture that we took. We parked our car, we walked, and you don't know what used to be there. So I think, again, in the news, we're seeing all these pictures of rubble, but you have to think about what was there before, who was there. There's many other pictures where, this is the Çarşı area. People are shopping, people are walking around, they're having they're going about their days, and it just doesn't. On the other hand, there are areas that did not collapse as strongly, but then according to the damage assessment database that we did find, all of those buildings, all of these are marked as heavy damage, which means they're likely all going to be demolished. So all of these people, they may have gotten out alive, but their lives are going to be uprooted. Of course, there was also major historic buildings, and yeah, I can't even describe to you the devastation in Antakya. The way I shared it with my friends was just by showing videos, like 4 minutes of us just driving, and it's just damage, collapse after collapse after collapse. You cannot capture it in just one picture. Okay. Damage assessments. This is very important. This is what everybody, all the locals, that's what they want to know. Are you here to tell me what level of damage I have? There was a different style of doing it. There were a lot of appeals. A lot of people put this on their buildings saying they did not come into my building. They did not see my crack. I want another evaluation. So there was a lot of appeals. And there's also what I'm trying to track is what is the status of the damage assessments. This map is very informative. It shows about 200,000 damage assessments. The data is not available anymore. And then there's a government report that actually 1.7 million buildings have been inspected. The math is a little difficult to believe, to be honest. That means, from what I understand, it's about 1,000 buildings per inspector in 10 days. That's about 5 minutes per building. Yes, in Turkey, it is very possible. Yeah. And I've seen the training. It's 127 pages is the training. And somehow you're just able to do that. I mean, just walking along one of these buildings is fine. But again, the damage is severe. And in Malatya, this is new. This is not when I was there, but they have actually canceled all damage assessments because someone had marked the building medium, reduced it to low, and then in the second earthquake in February 27th, that building collapsed. So only. Okay, how can we do better? There's a lot to be shared there. This is the İnşaat Mühendisleri Odası building. Everything is devastated. However, behind it is the Mimarlar Odası. Also, in the middle of the rubble, there's the architects building. So we do our own buildings really well. There are too many civil engineers graduating in Turkey, and all of them can immediately design a building. I've been an engineer for 22 years. Do not let me design a building. Because there's no licensing, there isn't an account for engineers. There has to be, they have to feel responsible. You have to be able to sue them. I mean, that's the American way maybe, but you have to be able to sue them. What tools do they have? They have software packages that are quick, easy, dirty. They don't make you think very much. This is a software tool we use for fancy analysis. And in the preface of that, it says it has a very silly name because computer programs lack intelligence. The people who use it have to be to be able to design properly. Müteahhits, there's a lot of müteahhits, and they're the ones who are being held responsible. But one of the things we also have to think about, who's reviewing these projects, who's reviewing these designs, these construction works, and everything about them. So that is a big part that is missing in Turkey right now. What does success look like? Istanbul has had a very successful program over the last 16 years. They rebuilt and strengthened schools and government. Sounds great. 16 years, 2.5 billion euros, 2,000 retrofits. Istanbul needs about 200,000 retrofits or strengthening projects. So again, the scale is really large. The recovery right now, 1.5 million people are living in tents and container cities that are now also being flooded. So again, another thing to think about. They're rebuilding really quickly using tunnel form construction, which we've seen to be pretty successful on the field. There's some thinking that has to go into urban planning. We have more teams on the ground that will bring even more detailed information back. But for engineering, the things that we took away were that the ground motions, it's going to change the way we think. Non-structural component bracing, this is what I was talking about at the hospital. So again, simple things like these ceilings that could fall on your head in an operating room has to be thought about. And what I'm really trying to get to in the next year, hopefully, is to identify simple retrofit solutions for masses of buildings in places like Istanbul, so that we can't give everybody a base isolated apartment building. So we'll have to think about that, and we have to educate consumers and keep engineers accountable.
Thank you very much, Ayşe. I appreciate your perspective. Next, we have Professor Greg Derline. He's the J. Professor of Engineering at the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering here at Stanford University. Professor Derline will focus on seismic design and collapse safety of buildings, and will also offer views of past experiences here in the US that have shaped codes and standards, something, of course, we could stand to benefit from. Professor Derline, thank you very much.
Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today, although maybe not the reason for the opportunity. So from a technical, so I'll talk about the engineering parts. From a technical standpoint, we now have the know-how to design buildings that are safe, that don't collapse. It's built on 100 years of kind of earthquake engineering research that we have and implementation into practice. But there's still vexing problems with getting that fully implemented. A fragmented design construction industry for buildings. So getting things implemented. There's a lot of existing buildings that have been built prior to current building codes that we have to deal with. And also, we're now looking beyond just the safety of buildings to the resilience of communities, which gets into what we call functional recovery of buildings, not tearing down buildings like Aisha showed some examples of. But to give a little bit of perspective of some of these challenges, I wanted to reflect on some of the experiences here in California on safety. About 90 years ago, 1933 Long Beach earthquake was one of the wake-up calls. This caused extensive damage to schools. 70 destroyed, 120 had major damage. They were fortunate. This earthquake occurred late in the afternoon and the schools were empty, so very small, only one casualty in these schools. But it really galvanized attention. So within a month, in fact, the Field Act was passed, which mandated tougher requirements of new schools. That was for the new schools right away. And then subsequently, a number of acts were implemented to look at reviewing buildings that were built before 1933, before the new provisions. Later in 1970s, there was a 1971 San Fernando earthquake. I'll talk a little more about that. Pointed out that some of what we thought was good construction before 1970, we discovered wasn't. So you had to go back and look at schools again. So subsequent bills were looking at built prior to the 1970s. But a lot of this percolates down to local communities, from the state school board to look for local communities to look at the at-risk schools and to deal with those. So that's part of the tricky part of this sort of implementation aspect. So in fact, part of that 1999 bill was to look at these existing vulnerable buildings in the school. And these were ones that were the non-wood frame buildings. And there's of those, about a quarter of the school buildings out there. But 2/3 of those, based on this survey made around the year 2000, were deemed vulnerable. So these are ones that kind of need attention. In cities like San Francisco that are more progressive than others, in fact, the number of those vulnerable buildings is smaller because they've done retrofit programs or they decommissioned schools, put up new schools. But interesting, even there, when you look at the private schools as opposed to the city-run schools, we'll find a larger population of vulnerable ones because we don't have the same accounting and so forth. Aisha mentioned the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute a couple of years ago put out a policy statement that was saying that schools by 2033, this is 100 years after the Long Beach earthquake, shall be unreinforced masonry free. Now, California has been quite proactive, but if you look at other nearby states, the state of Oregon and Washington and up in Canada, they've not been proactive about even the unreinforced masonry that we know is the most vulnerable. So you say, why is that the case? So partly it's a lack of maybe awareness or partly denial that it's not going to happen to me. But it also because maybe not an appreciation to really quantify how bad the risk is based on the building type, its location, configuration. Not all buildings are equally vulnerable. We saw that certainly in the earthquake in Turkey. 2 buildings that looked nominally, one collapsed and one didn't. So a lot of our research over the last 25 years here at Stanford and other universities in the US and around the world, looking at performance-based earthquake engineering. This is where we think very deliberately, first as engineers, to work close with the earth science colleagues to kind of characterize the ground shaking, not just the hazard or the intensity, but what's going to be the duration. What are the characteristics of those ground motions and how they affect buildings of different configurations? Developing advanced computer modeling techniques whereby we can simulate the response of these buildings and see how they perform and will they collapse, how much they'll drift in an earthquake. And then carrying that through to characterize the damage to the building, both to the structural components, but very important, as Aisha pointed out in a few of those hospital examples, the non-structural components, partition walls, the mechanical, electrical systems in the building. And finally, all of that information through to kind of consequence functions or decision variables, we call them. Because as engineers trying to communicate what the risks are in terms of the collapse safety, but the casualty risk in buildings, what's going to be the cost of making the repairs, and importantly for resilience, what's going to be the downtime? How long will buildings be out of commission that people won't be able to live in their houses or their apartments or be able to use their schools or offices? Now, about years ago, kind of a earlier generation of our performance methods were applied in a disaster scenario study. This was 2006, the 100th centennial of the 1906 earthquake, where the question was asked, what would happen to the San Francisco Bay Area where the 1906 earthquake, magnitude 7.9, to reoccur today? Interestingly, this was done a year after Hurricane Katrina had devastated the Gulf Coast of the US. So that kind of disaster was on people's minds. Through kind of all the numbers here, but the size of this scenario study, and of course, these scenarios, we want to kind of motivate action ahead of an earthquake, not wait for an earthquake to prompt action, but to have the scenarios ahead of time. You know, the magnitude was on the order of what happened in Hurricane Katrina. I was looking at the casualty rates here and adjusting for the difference. I think 14 million people in the affected area of Turkey, about half that many in the San Francisco Bay Area. But the casualty rate in this study of that just happened in the earthquake in Turkey. But as engineers, we don't just look at the problems, we're looking for solutions. So part of what this study did was to look for that out of the many 1.2 or 3 million buildings in the Bay Area, just 4% of them were responsible for 50% of the casualties. So you don't have to fix every building, you just have to find the most vulnerable ones. Also, it identified loss of housing, and in particular rental housing that affects different demographics in the community, different essential infrastructure. The scenario prompted action by the city of San Francisco that a few years later, it took 6 or 7 years, but a landmark law to require assessment and retrofit of some soft story apartment buildings. These are ones that were seen damaged, and this scenario study highlighted the vulnerability of them. So the city took it upon themselves. These are privately owned buildings, so it's a pretty big political move to require assessment and retrofit of these private buildings. Also looking at vulnerable infrastructure, the water in San Francisco comes from Hetch Hetchy Reservoir in the Sierras, about 290 kilometers away. But looking at retrofitting of that system. Now, both of these measures were a little bit, we'll call them low-hanging fruit. Even though they were private buildings, the cost of the retrofit for the wood frame structures that are shown here, it's in the order of tens to low hundreds of $1,000s. You know, so it's something that's kind of manageable to bear in those cases. And of course, in the water utility, a much bigger cost, but they could quote bonds and things for that. The other type of hazard that San Francisco and other cities has, and we saw it dramatically in Turkey, are these non-ductile concrete buildings. In the United States, we became aware of this most dramatically in the 1971 San Fernando earthquake, where the Olive View Hospital, that was a brand new hospital built according to the best seismic standards of the time in 1970, came close. Had it have collapsed, the number of casualties would have been, there's only one casualty in a building much higher. Nearby in the Veterans Hospital, they weren't so fortunate. Some concrete and masonry buildings collapsed there. And in fact, the collapse in those buildings was about 2/3 of the casualties that occurred in that earthquake. This really galvanized immediate changes to research to change building codes for these concrete structures, Hospital Safety Act, actually a National Earthquake Hazard Reduction. So there's increased awareness, and so new buildings were being changed subsequent to this, and there was awareness of the danger to existing buildings, but relatively little being done. Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989, Northridge earthquake 1994 had damage to non-ductile concrete structures, both buildings and also tragically in Loma Prieta to highway structures. In the Christchurch earthquake in 2011, another area very progressive in terms of design. 2/3 again of the casualties in that earthquake occurred in 2 buildings, reinforced concrete buildings, one of which was built in 1986. This was subsequent to changes in the building code. So mistakes are made. 2015, City of Los Angeles started to induct or enact legislation similar to that in San Francisco, but also to address the non-ductile concrete buildings, albeit with a 25-year, recognizing the challenge of getting inspections done and getting it through and these retrofits accomplished. So what do we do in research to address, say, for example, the existing non-ductile concrete buildings? Well, it's understanding the behavior of those. So looking at the details in these older buildings, doing laboratory tests, then from those developing computer models so we could better simulate the response of buildings of different characteristics, different heights and configurations, and understand. And this, in addition to looking at design or details for new buildings, comes into our building codes. I show a couple here. On the left are shown the building codes in the US. It's a standard that gets adopted locally by states and jurisdictions. And in particular, the American Concrete Institute, which is the requirements for reinforced concrete buildings, is used for new construction. And again, if this is followed kind of construction quality assurance, these buildings will be safe. They may experience damage after earthquakes, they'll be safe. And these are known in Turkey. They're interesting. I looked up there's ACI has offices or chapters all around the world. In Turkey, 1994, the American Concrete Institute, a chapter was formed by engineers in Turkey, avail themselves of this information. Another big important move in codes and standards, though, has been looking at existing buildings. How do we have guidelines for engineers so they could more affordably, without it being a huge research project, to look and assess an existing building and devise a retrofit strategy that would be cost effective and economical. And in fact, Aisha with the Applied Technology Council works together with folks in research like myself and also with engineers to put together guidelines. And one of these that was issued just a few years ago is looking at particularly these older collapse vulnerable non-ductile concrete. Part of it is to try to make it more affordable, cost effective to assess these buildings so that if like the city of LA did, different owners can hire engineers and it's not too expensive to assess how vulnerable the building is on a scale from a very risky building to one that might be an older building, but because of its configuration, it's not as risky. So putting together guidelines like that are important. In terms of what we're doing, I showed earlier that scenario study that was done about 15 years ago. With these advanced performance-based methods we have now with better computer models of individual buildings, the information on seismic hazard, understanding ground motions and soil effects on structures, to try to integrate these advanced models for individual buildings into high-resolution regional simulations of cities. And as a structural engineer, then this enables us to go beyond thinking about the safety of an individual for an owner to help working in cities and other jurisdictions to understand the safety of communities, with this higher resolution to understand where are the pockets of bad buildings based on the soil, or where's the highest vulnerability from seismic shaking, and really to then start to think about what are the appropriate policies that might be taken to assess and retrofit buildings to really try to target those interventions where they'll do the most good, recognizing the enormity of the problem that you can't retrofit everything. So to kind of do this, we've recently been developing computational models that stitch together information on, say, for instance, databases, on high resolution databases of building inventories, of geotechnical information on soil together with, and then couple that with the latest information on seismic hazard, as Bill described. Turkey has some of the most advanced seismic networks and information on the hazard. Integrate that into these high resolution simulations. Couple these with advanced models of how buildings are going to perform, what their damage is going to be, and ultimately then try to relate that to the resilience of the communities. When an earthquake occurs, understand what's the damage and impact going to be. We want to minimize that, but also we want to be looking beyond that at recovery of communities. And with recovery, I think it's important to recognize that right now we're seeing the response in Turkey and many earthquakes. There's often from the international community a lot of attention to response. It's when the emergency response goes away and communities are left to recover, that long haul that takes years. That's one of the huge challenges ahead. So finally, my last slide here is to talk about some implementation challenges for these kind of, if you will, engineering technical solutions. One is to look at the risk trajectories over time, to recognize community risk, no matter what we do, as cities grow, as populations grow and more people move into cities, no matter what we do, how well we build, there'll be more exposure there. So there's going to be more risk there. When we look at these scenarios of what's happening in a city, we could take a snapshot of the present, but then when we look at interventions for the future, we need to anticipate this is going to play out over time. As Bill mentioned in one of his slides, thinking about exposure, where you build buildings, it relates to planning and so forth, things like that. So one of the things we're doing with models is to try to look at these regional models, but also to start to interact with people in urban planning so that you can look ahead, and when you plan interventions, be looking, you want to make the city safer 5, 10, 20 years out. So in a few bullet points there, the key thing you've heard from several of us, quantifying the risk, hazard, exposure, but on the engineering side, really looking to drill into the vulnerabilities of things. Not just to look at the risk, but then identifying solutions. Some of those come from mitigation, changing building codes for new buildings, retrofit of existing ones. But the other is just on preparations for response and recovery. Hospitals being kind of, for instance, a key thing to make sure you harden hospitals and so you have the medical care you need after an earthquake. But then the key thing is overcoming the inertia of not changing. The many existing buildings, even for the construction of practices. I should talk about education of engineers, and that's only the start of the process. You still have to go through the whole building community, supply chains for materials. So a lot of that, there's a lot of inertia in the system to educate the community on the importance of this. Getting groups like yourself, business support, I think is really key to helping kind of propel this forward, because ultimately then it's going to be political in terms of mayors and other government having the will and spending to enact change. In fact, in the few cities and initiatives I mentioned in California, it was a mayor, a governor in place at that time that really embraced these ideas that helped drive those things forward. And finally, it's to devise implementation strategies to follow through, and that follow through takes years. I mean, you can set things in place today, but if you're looking at quality assurance, building a better workforce, better trained people, it's persistence, and it kind of takes years. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Derline. Really appreciate that. Okay, our final speaker this evening is the CEO and co-founder of One Concern, Ahmed Wani. One Concern is a resilience as a service solution provider that brings disaster science together with machine learning for better decision making. Ahmed Wani will discuss some of their work on data-driven approaches and physics-based models to help simulations that would aid response, structure planning, and mitigation. Ahmed, thank you for your time. Welcome.
Thank you, everyone. I will try to keep it under 10 minutes. Okay, well, first of all, it's such an honor to be here, and thank you for putting together this very important event. Seeing those pictures, especially from Aisha, it reminded me of my hometown Kashmir, because we had an earthquake back in 2005, 70,000 casualties. So it really brings that problem, makes it very personal. One concern is building what we call as the digital infrastructure for physical risk. We try to do three things: mapping, analyzing, and monitoring every piece of the built environment, and try to sort of better understand it to the economy. I'll try to blaze through some of these slides. because we have limited time. But let me give you guys an example. Back when we were getting started in 2015, 2016, one of the largest logistics companies in the world actually asked us to run analysis on their Seattle facility. This is their largest packaging on the West Coast. We ran a scenario of 10,000 earthquakes, all the whatever is possible, right? Like 6 magnitude all the way to 9 magnitude. And what we found was that at 6.5 to 6.7 type intensities, they lose power. At 7.3 around that kind of intensity, they start to not have water. In fact, at 7.8, the nearest bridge is shut down for inspection, which connects them to the port, right? And we realized that the building can actually sustain like an 8.8 magnitude hit without actually having much problems. In fact, turns out that's probably one of the safest buildings in the city of Seattle. And we had worked with the city government, the different departments to provide us data for all these, the water pipes and the power lines, etc. But what we really learned was that while a commercial facility in itself, that logistics facility can survive a 9 magnitude hit, but it may lose power, it may lose water, and it will not be really functional, right? Our second project was a hospital, which I would like to highlight in the Bay Area, right? This is one of the premier hospitals. And, as Professor Dearline mentioned, one of the main sources of water to this hospital is the reservoir, which is almost 170 miles away, right? And what we started to realize was, while the hospital is designed for a very large event, the weakest link might be the water system, right? Which might actually cripple the operating room, which I actually had number of examples as to what actually cripples the hospitals, right? So what we started to realize was that based on what side of the building, whether it's a data center, whether it's a hospital, whether it's a barber's shop, or whether it's the headquarters of a large bank, they are dependent, of course, based first of all on the safety of the building itself, but they're also dependent on certain other things around them to make their day-to-day happen. For some, it could be power. For instance, a data center, all it cares about is water to cool the data center, right? Nobody's visiting the data center every day, so they don't need roads and good access. A logistics company or a hospital need both, actually, right? Somebody needs emergency power, right? And for certain facilities, critical facilities, they may be okay with 4 hours of outage. Certain facilities are not okay with any outage, and certain facilities can, with 20 days of outage, right? We basically, started to realize that this risk is called dependency risk. These are not just the risks to the facilities, but the externalities, the public infrastructure, the water systems, the power systems, the road systems. In fact, this risk is growing at a much rapid pace. As climate exacerbates the hazard, in fact, the number of supply chain outages, weather related, in the US are growing at a much faster pace as compared to just the direct facilities themselves. And why is that the case? The reason is because of the infrastructure budget deficit. An economy like the US spends a lot in terms of its commercial facilities or industrial facilities, but nobody thinks enough in terms of like the ailing power or the supply chain disruptions, right? And so the status quo had been to really look at buildings individually, right? When we look at a building individually, we basically decide how much we want to invest, etc., in that building. And what we started to realize is we need to look at systems holistically when we are actually making infrastructure investments. One of our projects which we did, we started this almost 4 years back, was in Japan. One of our investors was the U.S. ambassador, the former U.S. ambassador to Japan, and luckily he had seen Fukushima, the tragedy up close. So if you just go to the news and see videos from Fukushima, and you see some of the research from the Tohoku University, you'll realize that the reactor was never inundated by the tsunami. It was actually standing tall. The problem was, there are many problems, but one of the biggest problems was they lost power from several miles out due to the earthquake, and the reactor started to get overheated. And then there were floodwaters, so the roads were blocked, so they couldn't get in. So all they had to do is to hook it up to a generator which was on the bottom floor to cool it down. 140 mayors from Japan wrote an hour by hour what happened during Fukushima and what decisions were taken. And it came to sort of understanding those ripple effects, second, third, and fourth order effects, which would have ultimately prevented that catastrophe. This thing has stopped working. Okay, so essentially what we started to do now, if you think about the problem, right, there is no download button for all the building data in the world, or all the water pipes in the world, and all the power lines in the world. So we have to make estimates, and we have to figure out the best way to collect that, right? And so at One Concern, the company where I work, we started to sort of realize, well, if we collect this data from a handful of cities, starting with the US, and then in Japan, could we basically infer the data for the rest of the cities? So even if we have data for like the major metropolitans in the US and the major metropolitans in Japan, could we then fill those data gaps using machine learning? And that's what we did. So essentially, we built a probabilistic, synthetically generated digital twin, we call it, of the built environment, where essentially, instead of a map, which is a two-dimensional map, we like to think of it more of like a graph. So think about like a spider's web, with nodes and edges. Like the node is every facility. The node is every other facility, and they're connected through these edges. And those edges are the water pipes, the power lines, the sewer lines, the road networks, the telephone networks, the internet cables. And we started populating as much data as we could about all the nodes and all the edges, right? So of course, it's probabilistic. We're never 100% sure that it is going to be right, but we try to make our best estimate. Of course, certain places we are more accurate than others. But now, once we have this calculated, we hit it with any type of disturbance. We could hit it with an earthquake, a flood, a terrorist attack, right? And now we can see those ripple effects, second, third, fourth order effects. And we propagate a single metric of downtime through the graph. So we are able to sort of say, oh, you know what? This building is going to have 45 hours of power outage because it's going to have 3 hours of outage because of these 10 electric poles, station, or that dam. And it is going to have 4 hours of highway outage because of these areas. And all these things propagate to that asset. So essentially, that's what One Concern's underlying technology does. And it all starts with, as Professor Dearline and I actually mentioned, understanding the built environment better, right? Besides US and Japan, we did a few sort of projects for some sort of multilateral organizations where we were able to, this is Dhaka, we were able to just, predict what the built construction materials for Dhaka could look like, right? Because, they had some data which they were able to share with us, and we were able to then use machine learning AI to sort of just predict the rest. And then this is an analysis on that. This is, that now you don't just have to map out the buildings, the material or the height of the buildings. You also have to understand where you get your power from, because we have to map out the full grid. So this is a stepwise framework on how you would understand, where your substation is and how many electric poles connect you and those kinds of things. And this is just an example of us basically using computer vision to figure out what an electric substation looks like. But essentially the idea is to basically use statistics machine learning techniques to be able to map out the physical world, the built world, right? And we start with the low-hanging fruit, like, hey, maybe we should start with the road networks and the power networks, then go stepwise to the internet or to the sewer lines. Right? You've seen versions of this slide many times. I'll not go into a lot of detail here. And now that basically, once you map out everything, you need to be able to then figure out, associate what we call as recovery functions to these. Now, we can't just have sort of a model for the US or Japan work in Turkey. So we have to incorporate sort of what the Turkish building codes looked like back in the 60s or 70s or 80s. How did the electric substations get constructed in the 90s versus in 2000? And so being able to incorporate those learnings from research are quite important. And then I'll skip all of this. This basically just shows how a certain model performs in terms of power outage. I hope this works. So once you've done all of the steps I kind of talked about, you are able to actually run an analysis. It's actually running here, but it's not running here. It's okay. Sure. It's okay. So essentially the idea is, we need to be able to, first of all, understand and map out the built environment. And, what we have realized, through our experience back in, the US and in Japan is that you have to map out the buildings as well as the infrastructure. Then once you understand this as a network, figure out what's the best use of every $100. Should you upgrade this water pipe? Because this could have ripple effects to a hospital, or should you upgrade that power line? Or should you upgrade actually that school? So essentially doing that at a system level is what we are able to enable. And we are kind of breaking this digital twin, both sort of 3 hours out or 30 years out, right? So in the US, we primarily do this on a medium to long-term planning basis, but in Japan, we do it more of a response basis. So municipalities use it for more of a real-time response, like in a flood, in a typhoon situation, where they're able to sort of see, oh, this route is going to be blocked, so maybe we should actually create an alternate route, etc. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ahmed, for the very informative presentation. So we are getting close to the end, but I do want to turn to the audience. If you have any questions that you would like to address to our speakers, please raise your hand if you have any questions for our audience, for our speakers. Okay. Oh, Timur, yeah.
I'm struck by, is there a kind of like a UN for earthquake preparedness? I know we mentioned ACI, but just like an overall embodied, it feels like such a global issue that feels like they should almost be bigger than one, like ACI or more than that.
Yeah, there are, well, the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute that Aisha mentioned, that is it's primarily US, but it has international chapters. There's also a International Association of Earthquake Engineers that has a conference every a network. So I think certainly researchers at universities and kind of leading engineers from these countries, there's a network of folks who, that's on the engineering side, who share notes with each other and things. And I'd imagine on areas like emergency response, there's likewise ones. There's other groups like we heard from the World Bank who are interested in investments that might have like a network of people, but you know, earth scientists have a worldwide network as well. So it's you know, I guess it's a set of different specialties. You know, there's not one specialty that covers it all. But I think there's pretty good communication if people want to find information.
If I can add a little bit to that, I mean, unfortunately, there's a lot of reinvention of the wheel going on over and over on different continents. So there are American codes, European codes, there are Asian codes, and while they might, they're quite different than each other. And one of the things that I did learn when I was in Turkey was that the Turkish new code is a little bit of this and a little bit of that. They're all good, but do they mesh together is something that actually needs to be studied.
Thank you very much. Any other? Aicha, and then
Thank you to all the speakers, really informative. My question is for Ahmet Fani. So you said that you're studying the States and Japan and you know, creating these models that could be applied to other cities. Is there any, like, do you also look for the country's development levels? I mean, do they matter in this kind of modeling, or are they not that important?
Well, to be honest, we've done sort of like kind of POC level projects in you know, around the world, like Bogota, not in Turkey, unfortunately, but you know, all the way to Bogota, Indonesia, and Dhaka, Bangladesh, certainly. But the two places where we are deployed are the US and right now, because it does take, you know, a certain amount of lead time, probably a couple of years, to be able to get the underlying necessary data, you know, and to incorporate the research, you know, of the building codes, etc., to get the digital twin up and running. So we don't have a global reach yet, and so it's, you know, it's different certainly in some of those areas.
thank you. And final question.
I was going to ask about the materials are used, like concrete structure, like why Turkey, it's the price, it's the money. Like, I mean, here the houses are not built that way, or steel has been used. And like, should there be a change on that, or?
That's more of a supply issue. I was asking a lot about that. Wooden construction is just non-existent in Turkey, and the price of steel is so high. And especially with the inflation, I think that's another thing that has really affected even newer construction. But everybody was telling me that even for the partition walls to put those steel studs, that's just out of the question, they were saying. Again, if you're really high end and brand new construction, they might be incorporating that. We heard a story about one of the newer hospitals switching over to that, but it's money is the problem.
Yeah, and I think reinforced concrete structures, if done properly, they could be just as resilient as or safe as, say, steel structures. Now, they do require reinforcement in them, and of course, that is often a more expensive, if not imported, material. But also the concrete itself, where it's tend to be, you know, an indigenous material. It's made out of sand, aggregate, and cement. Sometimes the cement's imported, but to get high quality, it's a very manufactured material. You know, the sand needs to be cleaned and graded and so forth. And I think so and concrete is prevalent around the world in masonry structures, but when you start to use it in multi-story high-rise buildings, you really need to pay attention to the quality of that material. So it can be done right, but it just needs, and it's a tough supply chain, you know, all the materials that go into that.
Thank you very much. And the final question.
Yes, final question. Mark, San Francisco earthquake, what's the likelihood? I know, but just everybody. I think everybody heard.
I think. Okay, so yeah.
I want you to scare everybody.
Yeah, right. So that's a very good question. So here in the Bay Area, we think about 1906. Okay, it's a little more than a century. And those earthquakes probably come once every 3 or so, so it's not impossible. It could happen. We think more about the fault network, however. And the big fault in the East Bay, many of you have heard of the Hayward Fault. It moves about every 150 years on average. It last moved in 1868, so do the math. So, but it's not just the one fault, and it's a similar situation in the Istanbul region. It's not just the big fault. It could be a different fault that moves. It's been longer, and that's why we think that the hazard is higher. So it's important to really keep that answer made. And just to, to take a lesson from my colleagues here, I think they've really outlined critical questions that can be looked at now while there's still time to do so.
Thank you. And then the final question.
Thank you all for your attendance. My question is related to the technology. Is prediction really impossible, or it's impossible at this point? With more, data and learning and, collection of data, do you think there will be chances to predict, in the future?
I think we can always be hopeful, but I think all of the science that we have done, particularly over the last 50 years, has said that do not count on this. It's a very slim chance. I think this earthquake really illustrates it. It began as a tiny event on a fault that wasn't important. And look what happened. How would we have predicted that? The one thing that we might be able to do better is what we call early warning. And that provides a little bit of time, but it doesn't provide a lot of time. It's not enough time to evacuate buildings. So you have to understand what your risk is and be prepared accordingly. I think that's the direction we have to go.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We've come to the end of our time. I'd like to thank all of our excellent speakers, William Ellsworth, Greg Derline, and Ahmed Wani for the time and insightful comments. I would also like to again recognize our co-sponsor for the event, the program on Turkey at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Dr. Ayça Alemdaroğlu was instrumental in putting this event together. So thank you on behalf of the board of directors. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming. We have a short networking reception immediately after this event. So please join us for that, and you can speak to our speakers and our visiting nations. And thank you all for coming. Good evening.